All right, everybody. So, kind of a quick podcast here in the light of, or in the wake of the massive LA Unified School District strike that was carried out by SEIU Local 99 and United Teachers Los Angeles that ended not too long ago, just a couple days ago, with a pretty substantial victory for the unions, huge pay raises. Not going to get into that too much here because it's been reported on and don't need to hear it. You don't need me to break some days old news. What I want to talk about here in this super quick podcast, quick for me anyway. I spent 4 days really writing this up. 4 just straight days working writing this up. What I want to do here, like I said, in the wake of the largest educational strike of its kind since 2018, is I wanted to talk about sort of the history behind the main union here, SEIU Local 99, Service Employees and International Union Local 99. I want to talk about their history, the relevant history of this union up to this current moment. So we're going back to about 2014, talking about what they were doing, how their workers were living and keeping up, what was going on in LA politics in a quick way up until this moment. And trying to talk about what could this possibly mean for the future of those workers in particular, and what we can learn from this moment as we attempt to organize our own workplaces. Certainly, if you're a teacher, if you're an educator listening to this is something we should take lessons from. And if you're anyone else, honestly, this should also come as a great inspiration to you when you're trying to organize your workplace. And I also want to do this little brief history up until the current moment, to talk about certain kinds of disinformation and lazy rhetoric and outright lies that get perpetrated by the government, the state in this case, the district in this case, and by dumbasses and reactionary nitwits who go online and just talk. Well, they lie all the time. They're completely dishonest. They're hypocrites. And I want to talk about, in a brief way, how they come up with their lies and why they are lies and should not be trusted. And the reason why I want to do that is because there are a lot of people who may not be, maybe not now so much because unionism is such a big part of the American landscape now, but there may still be people who, they go on Twitter, they don't know a lot about how modern education works in America, and they may not know a lot about how unions work really, or how these type of negotiations tend to bear out. And so I think being able to give these people context when they go online and they're faced with, lies from the district, from the superintendent, from reactionary dumbasses, and having this information out there for them is super important. So with all that said, no bells, no whistles, let's just get straight into this episode. So before the pandemic, SEIU Local 99 and UTLA, that's Service Employees International Union Local 99 and United Teachers Los Angeles, had been very effective in threatening strikes in order to secure some improvements to their working environment and wages. And so these two unions, SEIU Local 99 and UTLA, represent the teachers, in the case of UTLA, in the Los Angeles Unified School District, and the service employees in that same district. So service employees are people like cafeteria workers, so people who would serve and cook the food in these schools, bus drivers, the people who literally bring the children to the schools and then take them back. It also covers secretaries, accountants, stuff like that. It also covers people who do maintenance work. They maintain the air conditioning unit. It also covers technicians who would service the computer, stuff like any kind of worker who is there to service the school. They're not an educator or an administrator. They're covered by SEIU Local 99. This also covers certain special aides, like special education aides and nursing aides, stuff like that. So this is a union that covers a gigantic variety of work and labor in these schools. And so between these two unions, UTLA and SEIU Local 99, they have thousands, tens of thousands of workers represented against the district. And so, as I just said, these two unions have, before the pandemic, been very successful in threatening strikes to get certain concessions from the district. But, as is very common with unions in America, with strikes in America, with bargaining in America, a lot of these gains and concessions are kind of fleeting. and they're often victims to sort of predatory superintendents and state actors, and obviously to the vagaries of the economy in some pretty important ways. Though, as we'll see in a second, it's also very easy to look at the economy as an excuse for why these unions suck, and we'll get to that in a second. But it is worth noting that when the economy is bad, a lot of the concessions and gains made by unions can be sort of outpaced by a faltering economy. So, back in 2014, LA Unified reached an agreement with SEIU Local 99 to raise its minimum wage for these service workers up to $15 an hour. So this was during a time, if you remember, so almost 10 years ago, when the fight for 15 was a major moment in our political landscape. Certainly not just for schools, not just for this particular union, but just all over the nation. And in certain places, they were successful in getting the minimum wage raised to $15 an hour. A couple places in Washington did. I believe some places in Oregon did. A lot on the West Coast, you saw some successes. Outside of there, I'm not too sure how it went down. But this union was successful in bringing up the minimum wage for its workers up to this standard during a pretty important flashpoint in our politics. So after threatening to strike, SEIU Local 99 got LA Unified to agree to an incremental raise to $15 an hour for its service workers. So to quote an outlet called LA School Report in her piece by Vanessa Romo in 2014, quote, "The 3-year phase brings workers up to $11 an hour for the coming school year," which would have been 2015, $13 an hour the following year, and $15 an hour in 2016-2017. So at the time this deal was negotiated, many of LAUSD service workers were the lowest paid employees in LAUSD. So let's contrast that fact with what the superintendent at this time was making. So this would be John Deasy. He was making well over $400,000 a year for his job as the superintendent. I think when I read it, it was like $449,000 a year to be the superintendent. So Deasy is, I was going to say an interesting person. He's not an interesting. He's actually quite the opposite. He's a corporate scumbag, just like a lot of these types of people are. Nationally, and certainly in LA, he's probably most famous for this cockamamie tech bro plan to give iPads to all the LAUSD students, which, I mean, again, it was a cockamamie plan, very stupid. It cost tons of money because these things are expensive. These iPads are expensive, especially back then. And in terms of like what impact this program had on its students, it didn't really make anyone learn anything any better. They just had this ridiculous iPad they had to use. And the reason why this became kind of famous, besides the fact that it was pointless and expensive, was that later it would become known that Deasy made this program, this iPad handout program, with consultation from executives from both Apple, who obviously are the maker of the iPads, and executives from Pearson. So Pearson, if you don't know, is this just god-awful, predatory, disgusting, corrosive educational company, private education company. What they do basically is they sell like education modules, they sell education apps to both public schools and to sort of like education startups, so private education startups, tutoring centers. I've worked for a bunch of places that use Pearson apps. And in a world where like these things should just be made available by our public school system, Pearson here has managed to privatize a lot of it and sell a bunch of it for a very nice profit. They make tons of money, these fucking assholes. And so Deasy was found to have connections to executives in both Apple and Pearson, and this is a major reason why he started this stupid iPad program. And when this was revealed back in late 2014, this was the impetus for him to step down as superintendent out of embarrassment more than anything. But in terms of like how he was like a superintendent, Deasy was kind of a lightweight as far as, you know, what he's there to do. You know, when you think about the superintendent, this is what you should keep in mind as you keep listening to this episode and to future episodes in this little series I'm doing about the union fights in LAUSD. The superintendent really is there primarily to give excuses for why wages can't be raised and to union bust as much as possible. And as far as how good he was at that job, DZ is kind of a lightweight. So he left his position when he was found to have these connections to Apple and to Pearson, and he was embarrassed. When he stepped down, he blamed the unions for mischaracterizing his leadership, which is, very funny, but that's par for the course. So he actually came into the superintendent's office with a plan to be conciliatory towards the unions. And his budgets, particularly the one in 2014, they weren't received too badly by either union, UTLA or SEIU Local 99. His style of leadership coincided with sort of the tail end of the Obama administration, this sort of age of nice democratic corporatism, and also with an upturn in the economy nationwide and in Los Angeles in particular. Which is coming, if we're talking about Los Angeles, this is coming after just years and years and years of cuts across the board in all of its schools in the years following the Great Recession. On top of that, the district, since the economy was turning up a little bit, was also receiving fresh money from the Californian state. So this would have been John Brown, Governor Brown at the time, who was pumping in some new money into the district. So for the district, LAUSD, for the first time since the Great Recession and since all these cuts, is finding itself not only with some money, but also with an opportunity to actually increase wages for workers, and is starting to give a little space to these unions to demand increases to their wages. For all these reasons, 2014 is kind of a turning point in the relationship between these two unions and LAUSD. Even so, though, these gains were not huge, right? And they, like I said, they are also kind of fleeting. These incremental raises to $15 an hour were only guaranteed after the first year, when it was supposed to be increased to $11 an hour. So these 2% raises after the first year would be, and I'm quoting here, contingent on the district identifying increased revenues and or reductions in operating expenses sufficient to fund the budgetary impacts of these wage increases, end quote, according to Romo's article I was mentioning before. So the contract had given the district an out, essentially, after 2015, to basically say to people we don't have money, so we're not going to honor the rest of the wage increases. And the contract has made it basically contingent on them, and largely them alone, the district, to be able to make this call. And they took this out. After 2015, they did not honor these wages, as I'll explain in a moment. And in fact, many people at the time that this contract was signed expected them to do exactly this, which is why a lot of people were they were excited that the threat of the strike managed to get them this far, but were suspicious that these gains would have meant anything after a year or so. For example, in a piece by the LA Times that was published in the wake of this deal, they quoted, for some fucking reason, they decided to quote this conservative think tank writer. So basically a useless, skillless flatfish on the economy. The LA Times decided to get a quote from this dumb asshole. I'm not gonna name him. His name is not important, or the think tank he works for. It's not important. I'll link to the piece in the works site that I have there. But who this guy is not important. But they do quote him as saying, quote, "Funds that are now going to be redirected to low-wage workers will have to come from somewhere. Where will that belt tightening occur? How much effect will that belt tightening have on children in the classrooms? While revenues are better now, it was just a couple years ago that LAUSD ran deficits in the hundreds of millions of dollars. With California's economy subject to roller coaster ups and downs, is it prudent to nearly double the wages of these employees?" And to that, my reaction at the time would have been something like, I have an idea where these funds, where this belt tightening could occur, right? We could tighten this belt around your fucking job, dumb asshole. We could completely eliminate your job, take all this surplus money that's being used to pay for you to write this shit and for the think tank you work for. We could just give that directly to service employees. Have we thought of that? Have you thought of that? fucking idiot. We could absolutely just liquidate all the people who are funding your line of work and all the people who do the work that you do and all these think tanks that give people like you these stupid, useless jobs. And, you know, maybe that wouldn't pay for all the workers, but it would give them a little bit more than they have right now. Fucking useless asshole. Like, what kind of fucking objections what is this shit, right? Like, if this person, like, for just a day went to a school campus to sweep leaves from the ground and to, like, serve cafeteria food to children, they would have contributed to society, like, way more than they have their entire lives of being a conservative think tank contributor. Apart from my swearing there, though, like, this statement from this guy captures a lot of the boilerplate conservative, reactionary, dumbass responses to successful union action, particularly in public schools. So, like, you know, where's the money going to come from? Schools don't have the money. Like, when the economy goes bad, how will we pay everybody? What about the children? So, really quickly, to address these points, like I said, really quickly, schools have more money than we think and that they let on. But I'll go more into that a little bit later. But for now, let's just accept that as fact. Second, like, about, you know, the worries about how, like, union action will affect children in the classroom because, I don't know, because we're paying these people more, we're taking money away from them or some shit. I mean, just to take that seriously for 2 seconds, like, I can think about how not having this deal would have affected these children. Like, imagine how these students' learning would have suffered in these LA schools if, like, their fucking AC and heater systems were not functioning properly, and, like, their garbage containers, the garbage containers in the school were just constantly full of fucking shit and garbage all the time because no one was around to pick it up. Like when you think about that, how negatively would that have affected their learning? Like, those are things that would be happening if the workers were not getting paid enough, which they weren't, and which were things that were happening. Okay. Lastly, even if these schools were running in the red or whatever, like, I don't understand what that even fucking means for a government public service. Like, do public services need to make profit? Right? Does that sound right to you? Does every school need to be able to, like, save money every year? Like, why? Why is that important? Like, some people are just obsessed with this shit. I don't get it. Like, schools aren't, or at least they shouldn't be, like, businesses or financial instruments obsessed with keeping its balance in the black, right? That's not what they're there for. Like, public services conceptually have to be money-losing ventures because they're providing something that absolutely has to be provided, right? Like, you can't make a profit. You can't make a profit for that. Like, if these services are not provided, society suffers in a way that's completely unacceptable. Like, to expect these services to be financially responsible misses the point of why they exist. They have to exist. They simply must exist. If they're losing money, then the solution is just to give them more money from outside the system, from outside the school system specifically. Like, for these services, money is always there. It has to be, or else society, like, breaks apart. And in fact, money is always there for schools and for any other kind of public service you want to think about. It's always simply a matter of politicians and capitalists not wanting to make that money transfer. But this think tank writer was prescient about one thing. Like, he wasn't right about anything exactly, but prescient in terms of, like, the kinds of excuses that were going to be given for why these workers shouldn't get paid, which was how the Californian economy specifically would be used as a pretense not to honor the subsequent raises that the contract calls for. So this is the out that I mentioned earlier, and the district took it. As I said, by 2017, the district had not raised wages beyond the first 2% increase in that first year, and had also not restored a lot of the cuts that they had made since the Great Recession, particularly to special ed, among other things. So special ed, even after this contract was won, was still criminally underfunded, and the district had not done anything to rectify that. But now we're moving into a different turning point in the history of SEIU Local 99. So let's make a proper transition.
Okay, so let's talk for a second about union strength. So one of the big things that the Democrats have been pushing, the left has been pushing recently, is the idea that America's economy has not been growing equally because of the decline of American unions. That if unions were stronger, then they could be pushing the private sector for more wage gain in the private sector. The idea is particularly the manufacturing industry, that those industries have fallen behind, that the lack of union strength has led to all of this. You talk at length in Great Society about the union contribution to the Great Society, union involvement with the Great Society, and then you also talk about the fact that union states just basically stopped growing and very often fell behind economically. So what happened with America's unions? Were they good for America's economy? Were they bad? Where do they stand?
They made labor too expensive.
So now it's 2017. It's the summer of 2017, and a new budget for the Los Angeles Unified School District is being proposed. This time, the super is Michelle Keene. John Deasy stepped down 3 years ago, if you remember. So Keene was an interesting person, an interesting figure. She was the first black woman superintendent for LAUSD. And what it actually before was the deputy super under John Deasy before being promoted by the school board. So she was generally, just to give her a brief background, right? She was generally progressive in her politics. Like, she tried to protect arts and music in the schools from being cut. She fought to, as an example of her progressive politics, right? She fought for the preservation of DACA in her schools, which, a very good thing, honestly, if I'm speaking honestly. She tried to expand magnet schools to decrease the drain of the student population from public schools to charter schools. So she was well beloved in LA before and since becoming superintendent. She was a teacher who had worked her way up through the system to become sort of the top state person in the public school system in LA. And this actually makes her very distinctive, because most of the time supers, like especially in big cities, in big districts like in LA, these people are not a part of the local school system at all. And often they're not even from the same fucking city that they're taking this position in, and a lot of times they have no background at all in education in any respect. They were never teachers. They were never even like people like a Pearson dumbass who sold education products, right? For the most part, they're fucking financiers, businessmen, they're fucking corporate ghouls. And Michelle Keene was not that. If you want to give her credit for anything, she was not that at all. So she and the LAUSD school board is presenting a new budget which involved cuts, layoffs to a lot of clerking jobs, so a lot of accountants and other sort of low-level administration inside the district. Notably, this included library aides. So they were going to cut down on a lot of staffing in a lot of these schools' libraries. And these also included, once again, cuts in special ed, particularly to assistant aides. So staffing in this already underfunded part of schooling was going to be cut even more. They also start understaffing custodians, not as an explicit part of the budget, but this was something they start doing after the budget was proposed. They start understaffing custodians in a lot of these schools, leading to a lot of dirty schools, a lot of garbage not being picked up, a lot of very dirty, leafy campus grounds. Most importantly, I think for our purposes here, the district has not instituted the next rounds of pay raises that were contingent in the original agreement. While Keene herself never really spoke about the unions or this deal, at least as far as I could find, the actions of her district and the comments that she made about the budget when it was released do tell the story about why these raises were not honored. So speaking about the possibility of libraries and schools shutting down because, they're not being staffed, Keene said, quote, "If it's not this, it's going to be something else, because they have only a finite amount of dollars," the school she's talking about. So I think it's important that we do honor the decisions that principals and their team had to make to do what we've asked them to do. They're doing the best they can, given the constraints that have been provided to them, unfortunately, from the state, end quote. So later in her statement about the budget, she references some investment made to the district by the Californian state, but that the district would still, even with this investment from California, run a deficit of $422 million in 2019. Ooh, that's a big scary number, isn't it? $422 million deficit in the school year of 2019-2020, even though the current year's budget, 2017, would be balanced. So somehow within the next 2 years, King is saying that the district is going to run up a deficit of several hundred millions of dollars. So about this, she said, quote, Despite these investments, our district does continue to face an ongoing structural deficit, which is caused by deeply rooted issues such as declining enrollment and increases in fixed costs. End quote. SEIU Local 99 have been negotiating with the district since March of 2017, as they would be since, they haven't gotten the raises that they were promised in the original agreement. And at this time, they are passing through the summer, fall, and winter of 2017 with no progress at all in reaching a new agreement with the district and with Michelle King. Largely because the district insisted this entire time, the whole year of 2017, that they didn't have the money. One of the reasons they say they don't, as I read, as was obvious from King's statement I just read, was because, as they claimed, enrollment was declining during this time. Let's talk about that. Let's take a big tangent. Let's take a big aside and talk about that. That's a really important thing that can get people confused if they don't know what they're talking about. So the idea that a school budget can be tied to enrollment may seem kind of strange if you're not familiar with how American schools are funded. If you're not familiar with the American school system, like, it does kind of make it sound like students and their families are like customers to the schools who are in some way like buying education from the schools, right? It does kind of make it seem that way. It's not quite like that though. It's more like the state subsidizes these students for the schools, right? It's really more like the state is the customer for these students, if that makes sense. They buy these students for the schools so that they can go to those schools, right? That is kind of the essence of public service under capitalism, right? That's how single payer would work. You would just have this one payer for healthcare, and then everyone would have access to it. So kind of a similar thing right here. And so both the local state, so both California and the federal state, pay into it like this. And the way that they pay these schools for these students is that they count enrollment. Enrollment meaning a certain number of students who are at a school. I'll talk a little bit later about how this is not an exact science. It's not the exact science you may be expecting, but yeah, just stick with me on that for a bit. So this investment from the state based on the number of students that are in the school, depending on which school you're talking about, it's usually not like the biggest part of the budget at all. But the money that schools get from the state is significant, right? In most schools, it is significant enough to worry about. And it fluctuates based on enrollment numbers because enrollment numbers are always fluctuating year to year and basically decade to decade, and even within the same year, day to day, month to month. So essentially what happens is that bigger schools with more students and increasing enrollment get more money, while smaller schools that serve less students and maybe facing shrinking enrollments get less money. All with the idea that each student costs a certain amount to maintain in a school and to educate them. So the state gives a certain amount of money on a per student basis based on the cost of education that they've calculated for each individual student. Education per capita, if you want to put it that way. The reason this can result in deficits is because there are a lot of fixed costs in running a school. So buildings and campuses, for example, right? Those things, like, they don't expand or contract with increasing or declining enrollment numbers. Maybe in the future they might. Maybe that's the future of education, like these fucking accordion buildings and campuses that can shrink and grow depending on how many students are using them. But for right now, schools are made out of steel and concrete. So when enrollment drops in a school and less students are using like those same air conditioning systems, those same classrooms, the same gym, they're using the same cafeteria, right? That's considered a waste of resources because they're not using those land assets to their fullest extent. This is also the case for things like school bus drivers and cafeteria workers, for service employees, who are all a part of the student maintenance infrastructure that was paid for to accommodate a certain number of students, right? So if you hire service workers to maintain a school for like 3,000 students, right? But you're only getting, like, over a couple years, you're now only serving 2,500 students. The state would only give you money for 2,500 students. And now, suddenly, this school is running at a deficit. And now, suddenly, you're also paying for a workforce that is meant to service a much higher number of students that they're currently servicing. And that is a, quote unquote, waste of money. At least that is how the sob story from the district and the state goes, right? So let's actually take this sob story at face value for a second. We should be skeptical about this story at the face, but let's actually take it at face value for right now. So lower enrollment numbers means schools run at a loss and aren't quote unquote solvent, or whatever the fuck. My response to that, as before, is, so what? Like, who cares if a service that is absolutely fucking necessary isn't, like, perfectly solvent in that way? Like, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about, like, running Vox? Are we talking about running BuzzFeed? Are we talking about running McDonald's or a Starbucks or some shit like that? Like, no. Like, who cares if those businesses, like, fall or if they survive, right? No one actually cares if all the Starbucks in fucking America were replaced with a Pete's, right? If Starbucks went into receivership or went into bankruptcy and then Pete's came and took it over, right? No one would give a shit. Business comes and goes. If we were having, like, a decent enough society, like a 5% better society, like a real social democracy, like, whenever these businesses come and go, workers would be given the support they need to survive these cycles so that they can quickly go into a new job when businesses are back on the rise. But no one should care in and of itself whether these places come and go, right? No one should care about the existence of any individual business. In fact, if you're taking capitalism seriously as a thought, as an ideology, the fact that businesses come and go is part of it. That's part of what makes it quote unquote work. So there's no reason to get attached to any of that. But as I said before, schools are not businesses in that sense, or at least they shouldn't be. We shouldn't be used to their existence coming and going. That's not right. That's not stable. Education is a public service without which people would suffer, like, immensely. They would suffer incredibly in the current order of the world. And these types of services, I'm going to tell you right now, these services cannot be operated without losses in the business sense. They just can't. Like, I've come to this conclusion about basically everything that the government provides that's necessary. So, like, for example, waste management, garbage collection, recycling, like pollution reduction, all that shit, etc., like, none of that can be realistically privatized into a profitable business, or at least it can't, while also being done adequately, right? That's one of the reasons why pollution is so rampant everywhere. Waste management has become privatized, and these businesses can't make money doing any of this stuff in a safe, environmentally friendly, and responsible way. So they cut corners all the time, and that's why shit is so fucked up. So, like, to have these things done adequately, they have to be done at a loss, which in capitalism only the state can really take on. It's the same thing with schools. Good public education, so small class sizes, like an adequate teacher's apprenticeship system, like, not credentialism, right? I'm absolutely not in favor in any system where workers pay for their own training. No, the state would take on that. But also, on top of that, a well-paid service worker force to make sure campuses are clean and safe, and that air conditioning runs when it's hot, heaters can run when it's cold, and nice healthy food is there. And again, whatever you think is a part of a good school system, etc., like, none of that can be made to make a profit. And so now people are gonna go, oh no, this part of society loses money. Oh no, like, they get all fucking panicky when they hear like Michelle King say, we're gonna run a deficit of $422 million. Like, oh no, like, what happens when you don't run this deficit, assuming that she was actually talking like real talk. What happens when you don't spend this money? Like, society as we know it, like, stops existing. So, right? So those are your choices, right? That, like, on one hand, we run a $422 million deficit. On the other hand, society dissolves. We have to pick one of those choices. But like I said, that's the answer we should give if we're taking these costs at face value, which like I said before, we should not. Like, the reality is that when talking about like cost of student investments and like the cost to educate each student, cost of education per student, the state is always lowballing schools with these investments. They are always giving a very low number for like the cost per student investment. If the state took enrollment-based budgeting seriously, and it doesn't, by the way, it absolutely does not. It only ever talks about this when it needs to use these enrollment numbers as a cudgel against unions. What the state would be doing would be giving away way more money than it currently does right now. Way more money. The project for decades now, when it comes to enrollment-based budgeting and investments, and this was certainly Michelle King's project. This is the project of every superintendent, so everywhere in the world, and certainly in every big district like in Los Angeles. The project is to make graduation rates and student test scores go up while making cost per student investments go down. So the idea is we want to make students succeed in a certain way, graduating, getting good test scores, while also not giving them a lot of money, as little money as humanly possible. Like I said, the money is there. The state just needs to give it up. And if that's a fight, like, you're listening to that and you're like, that's a conversation you don't want to have for whatever fucking reason. You think you want to improve schools, but you don't want to make the state actually give up money that it almost certainly has to give to these schools. Okay, there are a bunch of different ways schools can be made to deal with lower enrollment numbers besides cutting the wages of the lowest paid employees in the school system, right? All sorts of things you can do before you get to that point. For example, you could declare war on charter and private schools, right? Like, this is something these people don't talk about. But charters especially, and private schools, they suck up a mountain of students from the public education system. And not only do they steal those students away, they put them into a worse education environment, an environment that is ununionized primarily, that is not subject to any kind of oversight. It's a horrible place. These are horrible places for the most part. Like, at best, they're basically only as good as any kind of normal public school. At worst, they're absolute shitholes. The reason they exist is so that the state can carry on an education without those pesky unions around. And private schools, charter schools, obviously they are public school. They take a bunch of public money, but private schools too also take a bunch of public money through certain channels, right? And if they're gonna do that, they should all just be annihilated. If you care at all about decreasing enrollment numbers in private schools, these places just need to be annihilated. And all those students that they have in these charter schools and private schools would find their way back to the public school system. And honestly, that by itself would solve this problem without addressing anything structural. That by itself would solve a lot of these problems. Now, there's a lot of reasons why the super of Los Angeles Unified School District would never do that, but that's something to get into in a later episode. Again, if you don't want to do that, you could also think about consolidating schools. Now, school consolidation, and what I mean here is not on the district level, but just combining like two schools into one bigger school. This is a complicated and very problematic process. It's not something that can be beneficial in every place, and I would even say in most cases it's not something that's super necessary or a good idea, but in certain cases it can be a solution if you're taking low enrollment seriously as a problem. So schools can benefit from the economy of scale. So two schools who are facing lower falling enrollment can combine on one campus and cut those fixed costs by a lot. Not exactly in half, right? That's not how that works, but like a lot. By not having to maintain two campuses with two different electrical systems, cafeteria, food systems, all that shit. You can serve the same number of students in just one place with just one lower fixed cost. Lots of, quote unquote wealthy schools that aren't exactly in like super wealthy places, but yet they end up having a bunch of money. This is how they end up having a bunch of money, because they tend to be the only school in a pretty big place serving thousands and thousands of students. So that's the economy of scale at work. They get a bunch of money even though their fixed costs are actually not all that big. So more state money concentrates into a smaller place. Now, school consolidation is messy and disruptive at the best of times, and by itself honestly is often an excuse by school boards and administrators to downsize and perform layoffs very unnecessarily. And like I said, in the best of times, consolidation will cost people jobs. It will absolutely ruin a lot of the education of a lot of students for a year or so. So any project of this kind should involve, for example, parachute payments to the people that will end up having their jobs be cut in this process, and then leadership from the district to help them move into a different place, to get jobs at a different place in the district. It should also be led and directed by teachers and students if this is going to happen. So, because they understand best what their needs are and how to meet them. Imagine that. Teachers and students are the people who understand schools the best. And it should be negotiated to minimize layoffs as much as possible as the primary priority. But honestly, if I'm talking, real talk right now, with the way enrollment trends are the way they are, and with the teacher shortages going the way that it's going, like, I can't imagine a responsibly done consolidation would result in people losing their jobs, right? Like, a lot of these campuses right now are going to go through some pretty big understaffing crises in the following years because of these trends. So this will have to be a solution that we need to be open-minded to. But again, if you're not open to that, that's a big scary thing. I would also suggest changing the way California counts enrollment. So this is what I was referring to before when I said that enrollment is not simply just looking at, just how many students are at a school, right? You would think it's like that. It's a little more complicated than that. California is what's known as an average daily attendance state, meaning that it counts enrollment by calculating average attendance over a given period of time. There are other ways to do it. I'll go into that in a second. So calculating enrollment in this way, like severely undercounts enrollment, because this may come as a shock to you. Like, no school in the world reports an average attendance of 100% at any time during the school year, right? Never. So by counting enrollment in this way, the state takes money away from the school that it actually needs to serve the students who are there, right? Because why would a student not be at school at any given point in time, right? They have all sorts of perfectly valid reasons to be absent. They're sick. Maybe they're chronically ill or disabled, and they need this time off from school because they need to take care of their fucking health. If they're truants, quote unquote, if they're that stupid derogatory term, that's often caused by major problems happening at their houses, instability around their neighborhoods, right? And so what they need then is not from that money to be taken from them, but money to be given to them so that they have that stability at school that they don't have at their homes and neighborhoods, right? So by counting attendance in this way, the California state takes money away from the students who probably need it the most. And the shitty part about this is that these absences, like chronic quote-unquote truancy, absences because of chronic health issues and disabilities, stuff like that, these types of absences happen way more often in higher poverty schools who are more dependent on state enrollment investments because their property taxes aren't as high. So they don't contribute as much to their budget as they do to wealthier schools. So wealthier schools, can be lax in their attendance because their attendance is not a big part of how they get their money. But in poorer schools, it's a much bigger, way more important part. And it's in these schools that absences happen to occur much more frequently. And so what the state is doing basically is punishing these schools for being poor, if you can believe that amazing piece of news. So this can be addressed very simply, right? We can switch California from average daily attendance to average daily membership style of counting, which counts enrollment by averaging the amount of students on a school's roll, regardless of whether they're actually present or not, right? So long as a student is enrolled in a very basic way at the school, they will count towards that school's enrollment. And so obviously that number can fluctuate, but not nearly as much as attendance does. So you could go even further than that and just not even have that count in the first place. You could just count the pure enrollment at the end of a school's enrollment period and just make one flat investment based on that number at the beginning of each school year or each certain pay period, right? You could just make a direct money transfer, no strings attached, so that the school has the money it needs to serve the amount of students that it actually thinks it's going to get. You could go even further than that, right, if you're actually being daring, and you could actually decouple enrollment from these investments from cost per student investments, either in part or in whole. So districts, for example, could allocate funds in terms of liquid money and just make direct liquid money transfer to these schools, as opposed to what they do right now, right? When you read about investments made in schools, a lot of these times, what these actually are not really money transfers, but they're allotments for certain kinds of staffing positions. And their promise is not to give money to these schools, but to let them hire more staff, again, which is very different from just getting money. So again, a very simple change would be just to give the schools money, and as opposed to like what this other kind of horseshit. You could also draft law or even just simple district policy that would require a set percentage of revenue to be earmarked for schools regardless of any other factors. So every year, each school is just guaranteed a certain percentage of the revenue, no matter what happens, no matter what their enrollment numbers are. They would just get that money by being a part of the district. So districts in the government, as another example, could equalize the disparities in property tax revenue. So by matching the amount for poorer schools, so that they're more at level with what wealthier schools are getting. So they can either match that amount from the state coffers, or wealthier schools can be taxed for their surplus that they get in their property taxes, and that surplus could be given to poorer schools that don't make as much in property taxes. Or, to give you another idea, district-wide funding could also be more affirmative, right? You could just give money to schools based on if they're serving more black students, if they're serving more students of color generally, if they're serving more disabled students, if they're serving more poor students, if they're serving more foreign students, etc., 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 right? Those schools would just get more money by having that population of students, as opposed to just their raw or their base attendance numbers. So what I mean by taking this tangent and explaining enrollment, explain all the different ways that we could address enrollment if we were taking it seriously. All this is to say that that simply saying, oh, enrollment is down, right? That's not an excuse for not paying the workers. That's not an excuse for a school not pay fair wages to its, again, their poorest employees. Always remember that money is always there if people took this seriously. It's always there if you want to find it. It is only a matter of people in control of that money not wanting to use it for these purposes. And I'm going to leave this question open to you. I wonder why. You should wonder why they don't want to do that. And as a quick conclusion to this part, I do just also want to bring up really quickly that public budgets for things like schools, but also in all kinds of government stuff, they can be very misleading in terms of what is actually happening with the money behind the scenes. Either misleading or outright lying in some cases. Not saying that that's what Michelle Keene is doing here, But yeah, often the government lies about what's actually going on in their budget. And the reason why they do this is to lay the groundwork to be able to say that, like, the school district, for example, is in financial trouble when actually they're fine. So when Michelle Keene says we're running a $422 million deficit, maybe not. Maybe that number may not actually be based in the shared reality that common working people have. But now back to the workers and the union and the district and negotiations. Now we're talking about 2018. So we've gone through all of 2017. Negotiations have not gone anywhere. We're catching up with SEIU Local 99. So like I said, after an entire year of failed negotiations, on April of 2018, April of the next year when after this whole thing started, SEIU Local 99 members vote to authorize a strike. So they're not voting to strike just yet. They voted for their union leadership to plan and date a strike. So this is a particularly weak time for LAUSD. Michelle Keene had to step away as a super in January 2018 for health reasons, and an interim is at the reins right now. A massive teacher strike in West Virginia had broke out in February of 2018 and had barely been over by this time. They were successful in a couple of gains. So this was the beginning of Red for Ed. Which was a massive nationwide burst of school employee strikes across the nation that lasted all of 2018 and about the first third of 2019. So this wave of strikes in schools will eventually spread to California and Los Angeles because UTLA will themselves strike in late 2018. And when SEIU Local 99 members vote to authorize a strike, UTLA were in the middle of their own negotiations with the district that were quickly breaking down. At the same time, city elections were also taking place. So it's not a big deal in terms of like the mayor, right? The mayor this time is Garcetti. He wins in a landslide. He's not challenged at all. He completely destroys all his competitors. But the school board competition is absolutely fierce. So for a couple years before, there had been like a halfway union-friendly presence on the board, which was now in danger of being replaced by a resurgent pro-school choice astroturf movement, bankrolled by a lot of charter school nut jobs and business nitwits. So during the spring, it was still unclear what direction the board would go into the future, right? Whether it would still be conciliatory towards the unions or whether it would take a bold anti-union stance, as many were predicting it would. So the danger of a hostile board may have helped the Local 99 membership be more inclined to strike, right? Because that was on the board in a way it hadn't been before. I think more importantly, though, if we're talking about the workers in this moment, is that the living standards in LA have been steadily getting worse and worse and worse for wage workers across the entire city and for the service workers. So for school employees specifically, it became common in the summer of 2015 and for a couple of years before to talk about the cruel summer, which is a term referring to how these lowest paid school employees, when the summer is there, they're obviously not getting a paycheck because they're not going to work at the school. And they often don't have, if they have work at all, it's not stable, but a lot of them, they don't have work at all during these summer months. And so you're already talking about a very impoverished and underpaid group of people that are now going 3 months without any kind of work at all, any kind of gainful employment at all. And this is a time when a lot of them suffer some pretty nasty poverty, some horrifying struggles, which I think a lot of you are familiar with. Maxing out your credit cards, going to loads of debt, having to take all sorts of odd jobs just to barely be able to eat every day. It's a really, really rough time if you're not familiar with Again, just the vagaries of having to work for a school and not having this employment for a gigantic period of time. It's really awful. That's why it's cruel. You know what I mean? Like the cruel summer, like this concept, this phenomenon was not really addressed during the 2014 negotiated contract and had been getting worse every summer since then. And so meanwhile, the one-time raise in 2015 for these workers had already been outpaced by the rising cost of living prices in LA. And if you remember from earlier, the district had refused to honor the subsequent pay raises, citing a lack of funds, as I went over before. So these people, as their lives have been getting worse and worse and worse, they've been at more or less the same level of wages as years before. So this was a particularly like hot moment for them in terms of like, man, life really fucking sucks. It's time for this to change. At the same time, the union was also pursuing legal action against the district due to a history of unlawful anti-union activities since 2014. So the union was denied access to voting sites by the district. The union was also spreading anti-union propaganda among a lot of the service employees. They were also harassing a lot of the union workers. It's a pretty militant time. It's a pretty sort of underhanded time by the district, and that, contrary to their purposes, to their goals, wasn't like cooling down the union, but it was actually inflaming them quite a bit. It was inflaming the union membership to take a more adversarial stance towards the district. So the district was, at this time, they were caught kind of flat-footed by a union membership that was more activated than they had thought. So a strike was scheduled for May by the union leaders on the same day that the new superintendent, Austin Beutner, was set to take office. This completely spooked the district. They were absolutely shook by this this development, because the union SEIU Local 99 had not called a strike in a long time prior to this. And during the negotiations, what the district called their, quote, last, best, and final offer, end quote, ended up not being exactly their last, best, and final offer. And so a new, more friendlier contract was agreed to before the strike took place. So the district did manage to save itself from a big strike by conceding a bunch of points. So this new, much more friendly contract, according to an article that was summarizing this in an outlet called the San Fernando Valley Sun, provided a, quote, 6% wage increase over 2 years and a wage reopened for year 3. There is a 3% wage hike retroactive to July 1st, 2017, when both parties ratify the contract. A 3% wage supplement, also effective as of July 1st, 2017, becomes an ongoing raise if the district is in good financial shape, end quote. So that means, according to the union's website, that for every hour worked in 2018-2019 school year, its membership would get a 3% raise. In March of 2019, if the district has a positive projection on its budget, then the raise remains. If both sides disagree with projections, the issue can be submitted to arbitration, end quote. So another victory here, right? It absolutely is a victory, pretty unambiguously, and it's worth noting here that union members scored another victory around the same time in the legislation arena in addressing the cruel summer. So Governor Brown in June of 2018 signed into the California budget, a summer bridge fund, a money match program guaranteed by the state. So this fund is like, it's still going, like this would like it's still a part of the school and state budget. This fund is a relief, basically. It's a relief safety net for service workers in school during the summer when they're not working. That's funded by contributions from the workers themselves, which are then matched dollar for dollar by the state, and so, which is then taken out of during the summer when, like I said, these people are not working. So this fund, as I said before, continues to this day and is it's unambiguously good that it exists, right? Something like this just had to exist, if this was going to keep going like this. So a good end of spring and a beginning of summer for the members of SEIU Local 99. So these are victories, right? Let's not get that twisted. These are absolutely victories for the side of the union and for the working membership of that union, but they are tenuous. We can tell that right away. By the first half of 2019, the SEIU Local 99 bargaining team was already back at the bargaining table with the district in order to push them to honor the contract because they were threatening not to. Again, I will say, though, this time these raises were honored on schedule by the district after pressure from the union. So the California state, at the same time, was also hard at work finding ways to deny service workers access to the Summer Bridge Fund program. And I mean, again, to this day, is constantly, quote unquote, having trouble doing full dollar-to-dollar contributions to this fund. Sometimes they only do 68 cents to the dollar, 70 cents to the dollar, right? So they're breaking their promises left and right. By this time in 2019, when the bargaining is happening again, Austin Beutner had been at his job for about a full year now. Beutner is the worst. He's an absolute fucking piece of shit. At least the worst for right now, right? It's going to get, in terms of superintendents, it's going to get much worse than him. But he is a terrible, awful, disgusting lizard man. So before he was superintendent, he was a private equity firm bastard, this dark money son of a bitch, before becoming a part of the Los Angeles city government, and was selected as superintendent by a largely pro-school choice, pro-charter school board. So during the LAUSD teacher strike in 2019, he kept talking about to anyone, any kind of news outlet that would listen. He kept saying over and over again about how, there's just not enough money to give to teachers. There's not enough money to give them what they want, while at the same time hiring picket line crossing substitutes, scabs, to teach while the actual teachers were on strike, right? Paying for them to do that. He was a pro-business scumbag, obsessed with doing worthless outreach to LA's business elite. So a completely useless, just sack of potatoes. Importantly for us here, and importantly for unions, he was also a huge pansy ass. Right, he had no spine at all. He had no charisma as a public servant, as a public figure. He had terrible stage presence. He never spoke confidently about any of his half-baked ideas as super. He was always getting talked into changing ideas and walking back earlier plans and statements. And his one obligation, honestly, when you actually look back on his record, on his time at the job, his one real obligation seemed to be telling the unions that the district doesn't have money to pay their workers, right? That seemed to be the only reason he was there. And that's a very easy target. It's a very easy opponent for an activated and powerful union. So UTLA's 2019 strike was broadly popular, actually, to the surprise, I think, of a lot of different government officials, state agents, and succeeded in forcing LA Mayor Eric Garcetti's hand. So LAUSD quickly agreed to a deal to spend more money in the way UTLA wanted. And Garcetti, in an interview with an outlet called LAIST, L-A-I-S-T, so LAIST, contradicted Beutner's constant claim of the district having no money in a pretty incredible interview, as I'm going to quote right here. So, quote, he said, "Oh, I think it's his job, Beutner's job, to be stressed out about finances, just as it is for me as mayor or the governor or any chief executive needs to make sure that they aren't over-promising. But as we began to dig into the finances, we realized that there was probably some common space where the district could stretch enough. The superintendent and the union have said in the future, we're going to probably need to go to the ballot and ask people if they want classes with 45 students in them. I tried to convince both sides to act responsibly, but aggressively. In other words, this is not the time to be conservative. This is the time to look at these reserves, but not recklessly." Garcetti ended up susceptible to strike and public pressure, and a ballot measure was drafted to try and meet UTLA's demands. So this was Measure EE, which was a partial tax on property owners to raise hundreds of millions of dollars for the district, for LAUSD. This measure did fail. The voters did strike it down largely through a very fake and overly funded reaction to the bill by LA's business elite, Beutner's pals. But looking back on this, right, these are all these occurrences are a sign of something good that's happening in LA, I would say, in terms of the unions. So there is a weak champion in Beutner on the side of the district as the super. LA's government has shown themselves to buckle under union pressure just now, and to buckle pretty quickly. The teachers and service employee unions are more publicly visible now, and they're also more broadly popular than they have been in generations, I would say. And there is now, at this point, I think over 2 years of striking and threatening to strike, which has successfully achieved certain stable gains. And it's starting to seem like the power of the LA school unions, both UTLA and SEIU Local 99, are growing. And they're growing during a very important point in American politics, in recent American politics. So Trump's presidency is coming to an end around this time. Union membership is very slowly increasing as the public sector unions. It's increasing there more than it is in the private sector. And people are starting to demand more in general from the state and from the rich, and from their coffers. The train is chugging along pretty optimistically towards a certain point, to put it kind of vaguely, right? But I think you understand what I mean there. But then it's late 2019, and a certain global health crisis is going to take this train off its rails and towards a completely different point. And it's going to leave all of SAIU's Local 99 members without a train. I don't know. They get left at a different stop that they were hoping for. I don't know. They took this train metaphor a little too fucking long. I don't know what I'm saying. They're going to end. The pandemic's going to mess shit up. Is what I'm trying to say here. But now, right now, we're getting into the most current history, which has been told by the SEIU Local 99 workers and UTLA's teachers, which had just gone on strike. So you don't need me to say that right now. This has been a podcast episode that's gone on for about an hour and almost like 20 minutes, I think, if I'm looking at my recording here. I'm almost certainly going to be wrong about that once I start editing it. So you don't need me to quickly summarize that here. That's going to be the subject for the next part in the series when I get to it. There will be a well-researched part 2 speaking about that. But for right now, I will just say I'm not going to make this episode any longer than it has to be. It was supposed to be a quick episode, and I did do the research pretty quickly, and I think this is a good time to end it. And it's also a good time to end it because right now I have like 500 tabs open across my phones and my computer, and I need to start fresh again when I do research for part 2. So hopefully you learned something today about the strike, about where these workers were coming from, about some brief history into school unionism, and some lessons that we could take from this, which I'll get into more in part 2. And so like I said, hope you learned something. Try and be safe out there. Power to the workers, and fuck LAUSD. Fuck them. I'm Axel. Like I said, look forward in the future to part 2 of this. Look also forward to the Bishop Sycamore stuff. Roy Johnson and all his adventures. That's going to come out pretty soon too. Yeah, we're very busy over here, man. But yeah, I'm Axel. This is a podcast. We're going to be releasing shit all the time now. And I'll see you all next time. Bye.